covered last time 8 of the holy convocations there in Leviticus 23. Do any of you remember the other 2 that happened not to be found in the Mosaic legislation but are found at a later time? Okay, Purim, that's one of them, P-U-R-I-M, the Feast of Purim. Where does that come from? It comes from the book of Esther. Purim's a plural word of pur, which means lot. When they cast lots on the day in which the Medo-Persian Empire would try to exterminate the Israelites. So that's the Feast of Purim. Now this is one that came about later, P-U-R-I-M, one that's not found in Mosaic legislation. What's the other one? I said there were 2. There are 10 holy convocations in all. You knew it, but you forgot it. That's the big fish that got away story there. What's the other one? Okay, Hanukkah. What's Hanukkah? The Feast of Lights. That's the other one. The only place we see that, matter of fact, in the Bible is over in the New Testament. You don't even find that Jewish feast in the Old Testament, but you find it over in the New. You can just remember it by its name, the Feast of Lights. But, of course, it's known today as Hanukkah. You'll see that the same way you'll see Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah on your calendars. Yes, brother? We've covered that one. Yeah. That's one of those 8. You go back and look there at your note. That's one of them there. Well, that finishes up Leviticus, and we come to the book of Numbers this evening, which goes by 2 different Hebrew names. We get our name number from the LXX in the Vulgate. Probably be good to remember both of these because both of these happen to be used by the Jews to refer to the book of Numbers. Wayed Haber. Go over to Numbers 1:1 and you'll see which words applied to each one of these names. Wayed Haber, and he spake. Well, that's not a very good name for a book. And he spake. That doesn't really tell you anything. That's what Wayed Haber is. Bamidbar is a little bit better, in the wilderness. And that's what the whole book of Numbers is about being in that great and terrible wilderness. So it's known by both of these, Wayed Haber and Bamidbar. We get our name, as I said, from the LXX and from the Vulgate. You say, where did the LXX and the Vulgate get that name, Numbers? Got it from 2 places in the book. Got it from chapter 1 and chapter 26. Both of which chapters contain a census. You know what a census is, a counting of heads by the government. And this was done in Israel of old by counting the men above the age of 20. We see one census taken in chapter 1 and the other census taken in chapter 26. And so I would say that either name, either Bamidbar, certainly not Wayed Haber, but Bamidbar or Numbers, either name would characterize the book adequately because it is and does take place in the wilderness, is taking place and did take place in the wilderness. And we do have the census in chapter 1 and a census in chapter 26. Both of which are very important, and so that's the numbering of the people, in other words, and that's where we get our name Numbers. Now, do you remember what King David did over in 2 Samuel 24? He numbered the people there, and he got in trouble for numbering the people. Remember that? But no one gets in trouble for numbering the people in chapter 1 nor in chapter 26. That's 2 Samuel 24. You remember why David got in trouble over in 2 Samuel for numbering the people? It was a sin for him to number the people. Why? Well, he was king, but why else? Pardon? Right. He wasn't trusting in the Lord. He was going to find out how many people he had in his church. Going to find out how many men he had. I'm not kidding there. That's right. You read the account. That's why he got in trouble, counting to find out how many people he had in his church. And he ended up having, I believe, 1.3 million men. And that's a big church to have, 1.3 million. But God took a good share of those out, killed all of them, got them out of there because King David had sinned and leaning to the arm of the flesh. In other words, rather than going to battle from that time forward in the name and in the strength of the Lord and with his faith, now he had 1 million people to fight for him, and he didn't need really to trust in the Lord anymore. And that's why it was a sin for him. It's not a sin for the people here. They only have about half that many people at this time, both in the men above the age of 20 and in all the people composite together. They only have about half that number here in the book of Numbers. But what they're doing here in Numbers, they're fixing to enter in or attempt to enter into the promised land, and their one purpose for entering in is to fulfill what God had said back in Genesis 15, to destroy those heathen nations that were there. And they were counting them in preparation for going into the promised land and destroying. In other words, they needed to know how many men they had to know how to divide things up and how to approach the land. Now remember, their first attempt into the land failed, and that's why we end up taking a second census over in chapter 26. That's why you've got two of them, because in between chapters 1 and 26, you have a period of about 38 years, and you have in chapters 13 and 14 their failure to enter into the promised land. And once they failed and they go wandering for around 38 years in the wilderness, when they come upon the southern and then finally the eastern borders of Palestine or the promised land for the second time, then it's time to take a second census, preparing them to go into the land. Now, in the first census, they end up with 603,550 men above the age of 20. 603,550. In the second census, they end up with 601,730, which gives us an approximate demise in numbers of 1,820 men between the first census and the second census. We'll be looking at both of these numbers so you can see what they are again and where they're found. Okay, you'll remember that the book of Leviticus, I trust all these things that we'll be giving you here will just help you more and more to understand what you're reading there. The book of Leviticus takes place in less than 2 weeks. We know it has to take place in less than 2 weeks and more than 8 days. So I generally just sum it up. It took place around 2 weeks, but we know it had to be somewhere between 8 days and 2 weeks. We have the whole book of Leviticus fitting in. Now, as far as the whole book of Numbers goes, how much time do we have from Numbers 1 to Numbers 36? 39 years. 39 years from the very beginning of the account in Numbers, which, by the way, the beginning of the account doesn't begin in verse 1. It begins in chapter 9 in verse 1. That's chronologically earlier than chapter 1 of the book of Numbers. You have a period of about 39 years here. As a matter of fact, look at verse 1 of Numbers, just to refresh your memory here about this particular verse. The Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month, in the second year after they were gone out of the land of Egypt, or after they were come out of the land of Egypt. First day of the second month. Go over to chapter 9 and verse 1. The Lord spake unto Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month. Doesn't tell us what day here, but in the first month of the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. And chapter 9, remember, is a chapter on the second Passover that they have. And it takes place in the first month of the year, known by the old calendar as Abib and by the post-exilic calendar as Nisan. We know that it took place in the first month. That's why chapter 9 has to come before chapter 1, at least chronologically. Other things that we'll say about this actual census that they took in chapter 1 next time, because it appears that they basically had taken this around 9 months earlier. But it's just a few more things as far as the numbers go. They already had the numbers down, because we see that back in the book of Leviticus. Well, I'll save that for next message. But Numbers 1 really takes place a lot earlier than it would appear it to be taking place here in the first chapter of Numbers. They're adding some additional things as far as their organization of the camp, preparing to march towards the promised land some of these things as far as counting up the numbers of the people that already done earlier in the book of Leviticus whenever they had to bring an offering for the sanctuary, which is something we'll look at next time. Now back to our map on the Exodus. We're a year now out of Egypt. Some people have the idea they just went out of Egypt and went into the Promised Land the next day, but they have a lot of preparation to do ahead of time. Remember, they've gone, we marked this out up here, they've gone across the southern end of the Bitter Lakes, gone down here, and this is where they've been now. All of the book of the book of Exodus is taking place in around a year. At least their camp here at Mount Sinai is taking place in a year. You've also got the book of Leviticus here. You also have the first portion of the book of Numbers while they are still at this point. And then it's after this. In other words, what they're doing, they finally received the law, the legislation, what they need to know. Now it's time to prepare physically to go on into the Promised Land. They prepared spiritually ahead of time, and so that's why they're taking this census, to find out how many people they have and find out how they're going to organize the camp in regards to their marching, because you've got 2.5, 3 million people here. They're going to be marching. And it's enough to keep, your own family in line behind you. And you've got 2.5 or 3 million people here, got to all get to the same place, same destination. So there's a lot of preparation that goes into this, which is what we find in the first third of Numbers. And then we'll find them taking on off up this route, going this way. Now that one other verse, if you can turn to Exodus 40 and verse 17, show you how all of this is just taking place around the same time period. This is when they actually set the tabernacle up. And this is in the first month of the second year, the same date as Numbers 9:1, the first month of the second year. So even though you've got a lot of chapters in between Exodus 40 and Numbers 9, it's the same month of the same year. Second year in the first month. So it's all around the same time period. It came to pass in the first month in the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was reared up. That's Exodus 40 and verse 17. Now we're still under the name of the book, and this name, Numbers, and especially this census that's taken here in chapter 1, gives us some problems according to what the critics have to say. Now you see in Numbers 1 and verse 46, here's where we have the total figure of compilation when they've added up the fighting men of 20 years old and above in all the tribes of Israel, even all they that were numbered. There's the word numbered. We get our word number. Were 600,000 and 3,550. Now comparing this with other statistics that are contemporary with us today, if you've got around 600,000 men who are above the age of 20, then that would put your whole population between 2.5 and 3 million people. This would include all of the women, this would include all of the children, this would include everyone below or beneath or under the age of 20. So just from figuring out, we don't need to know how many people are there. All we need to know are these men above the age of 20, and we can figure out they're between 2.5 and 3 million people in all. Now this is something to keep in mind as we're going throughout the Pentateuch, as we're going throughout what we'll be looking at tonight. This is not just a big group of people, 1,000 or 2,000 people. This is 3 million people. I mean, it's a phenomenal figure. It's like the whole city of Minneapolis and St. Paul. That's how many people you have together here. Not just a big group. Everyone pictures in their mind a big group that are marching out of Egypt. And it's not a big group, it's 3 million people that are marching out of the land of Egypt. Which speaks of the power and faithfulness of God to be able to sustain 3 million people in such a barren wilderness. But when we come along to what the critics have to say, 603,550 people or 601,730 people either figure, the first chapter, the 26th chapter of Numbers, is way too many people. And as a result, this is what the critics tell us, as a result, the critics have given us basically two ways that we can lower these numerical figures. And you read their writings, and they'll give you one of these two ways that they try to scripturally, of course, not harming the text any, scripturally, lower these numbers for several reasons that I'll be giving you after I give you their excuses. First of all, there are several reasons why they feel that 2.5 to 3 million people are too many people, and evidently this is not what God's trying to get across in Numbers chapter 1 and Numbers chapter 26. First of all, one way they can get around this, they tell us that the Hebrew word for 1,000 really means a family or a clan. It's the Hebrew word elep, this word right here. They tell us this word, which is the word used whenever you read the word 1,000 anywhere in Numbers 1. It's the Hebrew word elep. They say the word really means a family or a clan. And so, can you see what they're saying? Instead of having 603,000 people, you have 603. Change the word 1,000, put the word clan or family, you have 603 families. Now, that's not very many people there, 603 families. That's, even if they had, let's say, 10 people in a family, that's still not anything compared to 603,000 people. That's an entirely different figure there. And they do give us a scripture, 1 Samuel 10 and verse 19, where this Hebrew word elep really is, it's not in our authorized version, but it really should be translated family or clan here. 1 Samuel 10:19. Now here in 1 Samuel 10, Saul has already been anointed privately king by the prophet Samuel before what is taking place occurs here in 1 Samuel 10. We see both in the case of Saul and in the case of King David, they are both anointed in a private ceremony by Samuel before they're ever declared to be king publicly. But now that we turn to 1 Samuel 10, we have this public declaration of the kingship of Saul. Now, Samuel is rehearsing in the ears of the people how the kingship is going to be something, it's going to evolve into something that is not pleasing to them. The king's going to take your sons for war and your daughters for confectionaries and cooks and your horses and your lands and so forth. Verse 18, he said unto the children of Israel, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel, I brought up Israel out of Egypt and delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of all kingdoms and of them that oppressed you. Ye have this day rejected your God, who himself saved you out of all your adversities and your tribulations. Ye have said unto him, Nay, but set a king over us. Now therefore present yourselves before the Lord by your tribes and by your elect, which should in this particular case be translated families or clans rather than thousands. And we read on here, we can see very well. In other words, this word can be translated this. It all depends on the circumstance. It all depends on the context of the scripture in which we find this word elect. Now, what he's doing here, he's not asking them to present themselves by thousands. He's asking themselves to present themselves by their tribes. And then, of course, you're going to cast a lot for a certain tribe, and then you've got to be presented by your families. And he's going to cast a lot to find out which particular family from the tribe he needs to select. That's why we know it's not thousands here. And when Samuel had called all the tribes of Israel to come near, then the tribe of Benjamin was taken. And when he calls the tribe of Benjamin to come near, by their families, not by their thousands, because he's not going to pick 1,000 or 2,000 or 3. He's going to try to pick a family or a clan here. Then the family or the clan of Matri was taken, and Saul the son of Kish was taken, and when they sought him, he could not be found. Remember, he had hidden himself among the baggage on the outside of the camp, a little too frightened to appear before that many people and be anointed king here. So what the critics tell us is that we do have a case in 1 Samuel 10:19 where this Hebrew word elep should be translated, and is in other versions translated families or clans. Well, let's go back over to Numbers chapter 1. Numbers 1 in verse 46. The word that we have right after the elep is this word, me'at, and it means hundred or hundreds. Now we know in our own culture that you speak of thousands, hundreds, tens, and down to ones, or what you call the digits. You go thousands, hundreds, tens, and ones. Now this is pretty strange in verse 46 and in many other verses. Remember, he's counting up the number of people in each of these tribes, and it's always so many thousand and so many hundreds. I mean, in other words, it wouldn't make any sense to say there are so many clans and then there were so many hundreds, because the hundreds would be counting the clans and the clans would be counting the hundreds. In other words, he's trying to give us a numerical figure, a final figure. Even all they that were numbered were 600,000. Now they would read clans or families there, 603 clans or thousand, that is. But then it goes right to the number that successively comes below in our vocabulary and in their vocabulary, the word thousand, and that is 500. Then it goes down to 50, which is a measurement of tens. Thousands, hundreds, tens, and digits. Now what this would leave us with, you can tell he's going on a downward progression from a high number to a middle number to a low number. 1,000 number, 100 number, and then a 10 number. You all follow me what I'm saying there? Now this is completely backwards if what he's doing really is starting with a family or with a clan, because in a family, probably the largest average number you're going to have of men above the age of 20 would be maybe 5 or maybe a half a dozen men. So he'd be going down from 5 or a half a dozen, then he'd be going up to 100, then he'd be going back down into the 10 range. I should have probably drawn this out so you could follow me better. But we can tell that what he's trying to do is start with a high number, end up with a low number. I mean, it just makes sense to do that. He's not going to start with a low, go to a high, and then go back down to a low. So in this context, obviously this Hebrew word elep should be translated thousand, not family or clan. Then another excuse that they give us, if we don't follow that one, or swallow that one, whichever word is appropriate, then they say this number here is really the census that was taken during the time of David, but it was misplaced by a copyist back in the book of Numbers. That's probably the most popular one there. They say this is really a census taken during the time of David, but when a copyist was copying the scriptures, he got confused on where each census went, and he ended up putting a census from the Davidic era back in the Mosaic era, back in the book of Numbers. There are three things we can say about this excuse. Now, we could understand where one thing had been misplaced. If the census had only been misplaced from somewhere in Samuel or Kings, placed back in Numbers 1 and verse 46. The thing is, we find a figure like this, or very similar to this, in 6 different places in the Pentateuch, which means he would have just gotten totally confused and put that figure of a census during David's time back in 6 different places. 2 times in the book of Exodus, 4 times in the book of Numbers, we've got around the same figure, always being evidently substituted in here. Now, I want to give you these places, and you can turn to them and look and see where they are. First of all, over in Exodus chapter 12. See, it'd be easy to swap one verse in Numbers for one verse in Kings. But what this amounts to, if what they're saying is true, we're swapping that verse in Kings or Samuel or wherever they say that it is for 6 different places back in the Pentateuch. Now, you're not going to get confused and write the wrong number in 6 different places because we don't have one copyist that's copying all these things at the same time. Exodus 12:37, we're just given a round figure at this point, 600,000 on foot that were men besides children. The same number as in the book of Numbers, 600,000. Then in Exodus 38 and verse 26, Numbers 146, Numbers 2:32, Numbers 11:21, and Numbers 26:51. In all of these places we have a number that approximates 600,000 men above the age of 20. That's one thing wrong with that reasoning. Another thing wrong with that reasoning is that all of the figures for each of the individual 12 tribes would also have to be misplaced. Because this final number in Numbers 146 is simply the sum of 12 other numbers that have already been given us in that chapter, and all of the numbers happen to add up to 603,550. Now, if this number 603,550 was really taken from David's time, then look over in Numbers 1, verse 21. See, he's counting up each of the tribes. Those that were numbered of them, even of the tribe of Reuben, 40,6,500. Verse 23, those that were numbered of them, even of the tribe of Simeon, were 50,9,300. Verse 25, those that were numbered of them, even of the tribe of Gad, were 40,5,650. On and on and on, counting up all these tribes, and they happen to all add up to this verse 46. So if this verse 46 is not genuine, or if it's been mistaken by a copyist, then we're going to have to change the whole entire chapter of Numbers 1 around, because all these figures add up to that figure. And these are speaking of the 12 tribes as they're going to enter into the promised land, not the 12 tribes during David's time who have already been in the land for well over 100 years, several centuries, by the time King David comes along. And then our final argument against that is we are given a census of David, as I mentioned earlier, 2 Samuel 24:9, and it gives us the figure, and it's twice as large as our figure in Numbers. 2 Samuel 24:9. 24 and verse 9. And Joab gave up the sum of the number of the people unto the king, and there were in Israel 800,000 valiant men that drew the sword, and the men of Judah were 500,000 men, which gives us 1.3 million men above the age of 20. And that's almost exactly double what we find in Numbers 146, which shows us the census taken during David's time certainly could not have gotten confused by a copyist over in the book of Numbers. Now you say, well, why is it then that they are trying to get rid of that number? The one reason they're trying to get rid of it is because it's too high. Too high of a number, too many people. But why is it too many? Well, let me give you several reasons why they say the number is too high and what the Bible has to say. First of all, they tell us that 70 people could not possibly have multiplied into 3 million people in only 431 years. Remember the 70 people, 70 souls, Exodus 1, all the sons of Jacob and relatives and so forth that came into the land of Egypt were 70. That was in the year 1877 B.C. So you've got 70 people, just 70 people here, coming into Egypt in 1877, and by 1446, we have 3 million people, which represents around a tripling of the population every 45 years. Which is absolutely unheard of. A tripling of the population in 45 years. 431 years. They sojourned in the land for 430, and we know they've been out of it for about a year now. So it's 431 years, or 430. You can just remember it like that. Now, if you'll look back over in Exodus 1, I'll show you the verse that says that the 70 went down there. Verse 5, and all the souls that came out of the loins of Jacob were 70 souls, for Joseph was in Egypt already. 70. And now, on the basis of the figure of how many men above the age of 20 we have, we know that a total population is between 2.5 and 3 million people. And it's unheard of for a population to triple every 45 years, especially remembering the fact that these were slaves in Egypt, beaten cruelly, led a miserable way of life there. It would appear that it would have been very easy for many of them to die of malnutrition and hard labor and everything else there. Certainly you'd have maybe a small increase in the population if you've got 70 people, but nothing approaching the figure of a tripling of the population every 45 years. This is what they simply cannot believe. Well, what do the Scriptures have to say about that? Go back to Genesis chapter 13, and we'll see that God, in a very special promise, promised to Abraham that he would multiply his seed as the stars of heaven. Genesis chapter 13. Their argument is legitimate because we don't have anybody today that's tripling a population in 45 years that can go up from 70 people to 3 million people just in 430 years. I mean, you get married, that means 2 of you, and you have a child, that equals 3 of you. Now, how long is it going to take for that to keep on going? That child's got to grow up, he's got to marry, he's got to have a child, before you're going to get 3 million people out of 70 people. It's going to take a long, long time. Only took 431 years for them. And it's because God had given them a special, unique promise. This way, now that you see how great the growth has been, you'll see how special and unique his promise was. It wasn't just something off the wall. God said, I'm going to bless you and give you a lot of children. It was something supernatural that happened for them.
For the continuation of this message, please turn.
This way, now that you see how great the growth has been, you'll see how special and unique his promise was. It wasn't just something off the wall. God said, I'm going to bless you and give you a lot of children. It was something supernatural that happened for them. Verse 16, and I will make thy seed as the dust of the earth. Now he's speaking hyperbole here. So if a man can number the dust of the earth, then shall thy seed also be numbered. That's the promise of it. Look over in Exodus 1 again, and we'll see the fulfillment of this promise. And remember in Exodus 1, back during the time of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II, we're a lot earlier than in Numbers chapter 1. So we hadn't even had as much time for them to reproduce here in Exodus 1 as we do in Numbers 1. Exodus 1 in verse 12, here's the fulfillment, or part of the fulfillment of the promise that God gave to Abraham. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied and grew. An even better statement than that, look in verse 7. I think there's 5 different descriptions of how they grew. And the children of Israel were fruitful, number 1. They increased abundantly, number 2. They multiplied, number 3. They waxed exceeding mighty, number 4. And the land was filled with them, number 5. He's trying to get across a point there. He could have just said there are a lot of Israelites here in Egypt now. But he goes through 5 steps to prove there are a whole lot of Israelites here in Egypt. And this is a long time before Numbers 1. So certainly by the time we get over to Numbers 1, this figure of 2.5 to 3 million people posed no problem to us at all. God blessed them. They were very fertile, and we'll see here in Exodus 1, we'll have to turn, well, we're here now, we'll stay with that. We see that the women gave birth in a lively manner, which would seem to indicate they were all very healthy and they just had children just like that. Along with this same argument of reproducing that quickly, which is unheard of, this is not another argument, one we'll just tack on to this one, is the argument that the Hebrews in Egypt only had 2 midwives. That's in Exodus 1:15. Now this is what they tell us, that they only had 2 midwives. Now if you've got, let's just say you've got 1 million people, you think 2 midwives can handle the birth of 1 million people? No way. But the text does not say they only had 2 midwives. Watch what the text says. It implies some things that we have to take from it. It never says that they had 2 midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and these were the only 2 they had. The king of Egypt spake to the Hebrew midwives, of the which the name of the one was Shiphrah, and the name of the other Puah. And they said, see, they only had 2 midwives. And he said, when you do the office of a midwife to the Hebrew women, and see them upon the stools, if it be a son, then you shall kill him, but if it be a daughter, then she shall live. Well, obviously, these were simply two women who superintended many, many other midwives. They had it divided up into a twofold division, and Shiphrah took one division, and she was the superintendent over the midwives, and Puah was the superintendent over the other midwives. Because we can't fall into the trap of assuming there are only two midwives. They could never deliver that many children. And especially by the time you get to 3 million people. Just think how many people are born over in the Twin Cities every day. It's going to take a lot of women to handle all that. So we can assume they had a lot of women here. But just two of them, representative names, are all that are mentioned. Now we do come to another argument. That is, the wilderness of Sinai could never have sustained this many people for 40 years. That would be a physical impossibility. Would it have been? Certainly it would have been. We don't deny that it couldn't support that many people. The Bible never says it did support anybody. The Bible says that God supported his people. Now look over in Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 8, where Moses calls this a great and terrible wilderness. So we know it was something bad there. Yeah, Deuteronomy 8 and verse 15. See, if you get that number down to 603 families, well, they could make a living out there in the wilderness. They could scrape up enough food. But not for 3 million people. Where's some figures I read somewhere. Someone's calculated this up. It would take 50 railroad boxcars of manna per day to feed the Israelites, not counting the animals. 50 railroad boxcars packed full of manna. You know, just bring in the train full of manna there and dump it all out. That would feed the people for one day. That's not for a month's supply or anything. That's one day, and that doesn't count thousands and thousands and thousands of animals. We know they're going to use as sacrifices later on. They had to have them at that time. Thousands of animals there. Doesn't count for them. And that was their food. Water, it would have taken 12 million gallons of water per day to quench the thirst of these 3 million people. So it's really interesting here. It's really interesting what we have on our hands. You got to begin to think big, in other words, in order to picture what's going on here. Think how much water it's going to take. You can't just take an igloo cooler over there and feed Minneapolis with that. Or just one water fountain and turn the water fountain on. You know how long it takes you when you're at some place, a park or something, and you're standing in line and there are 3 people in front of you. It takes you 10 minutes to get a drink. What if you were standing in front of or behind 3 million people at that water fountain waiting to get a drink? You would die long before you had time to rebel against God there. You'd be rebelling in that line waiting for water, which is what they did on more than one occasion. Waiting for that water, rebelling, and so God killed all of them. That's our God too. So what we're saying, well, I never read the verse. Who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness? I mean, he makes it dramatic here to let us know it's not a pleasant place there. Wherein were fiery serpents, scorpions, and drought, and where there was no water. So we agree with the critics up to the point where they say that it was a physical impossibility for the wilderness to sustain the children of Israel. That's true. But as charismatic Christians believing in the whole Bible, we believe that God supernaturally took care of them in 3 areas concerning their sustenance. First of all, in the area of water. Look at several scriptures. Exodus 15 and verse 25. Exodus 15:25 is the first time they have water supplied for them. This is the bitter water of Merah. And he cried unto the Lord showed him a tree, which when he had cast into the waters were made sweet. There he made for them a statute and an ordinance, and there he proved them. Now again, don't think of just a little tiny pond here, because it's got to have 12 million gallons of water just to give everyone a drink And that's not counting how much animals can drink. I mean, maybe 40 million gallons of water is going to be in this one pool, wherever it is, that they've got to have turned sweet for them. The picture that goes through your mind is, of the Western movies, and he falls down before that little mud pot there and gets a drink of water out of that. But this has got to be a whole lake here, in other words, to give that many people a drink of water. Then Exodus 17, verses 1 to 6. And all the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin after their journeys according to the commandment of the Lord, and pitched in Rephidim. And there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did chide with Moses, and said, Give us water, that we may drink. Moses said unto them, Why chide ye with me? Wherefore do ye tempt the Lord? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses, and said, Wherefore is this, that thou hast brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried unto the Lord, saying, What shall I do unto this people? They be almost ready to stone me. And the Lord said unto Moses, Go on before the people, and take with thee of the elders of Israel, and thy rod wherewith thou smotest the river, take in thine hand, and go. Behold, I will stand before thee there upon the rock in Horeb. Thou shalt smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and the people may drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. So, no, the wilderness is not supplying their needs. God supernaturally is. And then a final case of water is over in Numbers 20, verses 7 to 11. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Take the rod. Now, some people feel that Moses sinned because he struck the rock. That's not true, though. Why is he taking the rod here? Why would God tell him to take the rod if he's not going to use it later on in the account? Take the rod, and gather thou the assembly together, thou and Aaron thy brother, and speak ye unto the rock before their eyes, and it shall give forth his water. Thou shalt bring forth to them water out of the rock, so thou shalt give the congregation and their beasts drink. And so Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he commanded him. And Moses and Aaron gathered the congregation together before the rock, and said unto them, Hear now, ye rebels, must we fetch you water out of this rock? And Moses lifted up his hand, and with his rod he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. So here 3 times that God has supernaturally supplied water for them. Now the same thing is true with both of these times where water comes out of the rock, which we have some very interesting scripture over in 1 Corinthians 10 that's very mysterious and puzzling there, speaking of that rock that followed them, that gave them a drink of water, which we're not going to get into tonight, but a similarity between both of these times when the water comes out as over against the illustration over in Exodus 15, where he simply cast a tree into some pool of water and it turned sweet, because in both of these cases, the natural mind and the denominational mind still thinks of striking the rock or speaking to the rock, whichever time you're referring to, and a little stream of water coming out of it. But again, remember how many people this has to sustain. So from the number of people, we know not a little stream, a river, a huge river came out of this rock, and I'll avoid the temptation to say any more about that. We'll teach on that sometime from 1 Corinthians chapter 10. But this is a whole river flowing out of a rock for them, which is what Jesus uses by analogy in several places, the rivers of living water. Not the little trickles, but a whole river had to come out of here. Had to supply all of them water, and water for all their beasts. Millions and millions and millions of gallons of water here for these people. Another area in which he supplied their needs was quail. That was their meat. Exodus 16, verses 11 to 13. Right after they've come out of Egypt now, they're already complaining. And so God is graciously supplying them meat for food, in addition to the bread or the manna, which they already have. This comes in Exodus 16, verses 11 to 13. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, I have heard the murmuring of the children of Israel. Speak unto them, saying, At even ye shall eat flesh, and in the morning ye shall be filled with bread. ye shall know that I am the Lord your God. And it came to pass that at even the quails came up and covered the camp, and in the morning the dew lay round about the host. Now, the manna that was given to them was permanent. It lasted for 40 years, as we see in verse 35. And the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years until they came to a land inhabited, which is found over in the book of Joshua. In Joshua, I believe, chapter 5. Joshua 5 and 12. And the manna ceased on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. Neither had the children of Israel manna any more, but they did eat of the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. That's Joshua 5:12. So the manna lasted from Exodus 16 over to Joshua 5, or a 40-year period. Now this is not true with the quail. They were always only a temporary supply given unto the people. There in Exodus 16, evidently only for one day they were supplied meat, but we know that they were not continually supplied meat, because we see over in Numbers 11, verses 31 to 33, the people complaining about meat again, which must mean they didn't have the quail at this time, and God's going to send them a quail for the second time. Numbers 11, 31 to 33. Now you want to turn over here because this is a problem text, Numbers 11:31, so we can go ahead and deal with it. We'll skip it when we get there. The way the King James has this written, it's a difficult text in the Hebrew to bring out what is really meant to be said in Numbers 11:31. And there went forth a wind from the Lord, and brought quails from the sea, and let them fall by the camp, as it were a day's journey on this side, and as it were a day's journey on the other side, round about the camp, as it were 2 cubits high upon the face of the earth. And the critics have loved this verse. A day's journey, is several miles on both sides of your camp. That is, from the outermost boundary of the camp, you've got several miles on all sides of the camp. It said that these quail came in, and they fell, and what it appears to be, in the end of verse 31, that they stacked up 3 feet on the ground, which, is like that. And if they cover the ground 3 feet high for several miles around, you've got enough food to feed the whole Soviet Union. You've got way too much food for the Israelites. They never could have picked up that much food. I had a figure of someone estimated how much that would be, and I don't have it, but it seems to me that it was something like 70,000 bushels of quail per day per Israelite, which is unreal. God didn't do that. We know that he didn't. What the Hebrew seems to be implying here is that when God calls these quail to come in by the wind, and this has been known to happen over there even since then, the wind pushed the quail down to the ground within 3 feet of the ground, and the Israelites knocked them out of the air with clubs as they flew along. Now that appears to be what he's trying to say here. Never could have stacked up 3 feet high on the ground all around the camp. That's just an impossibility. And even whenever this happened, it left them with plenty of quail to eat for a while. And of course, we know that because they ate in such haste and with such a spirit of gluttony, that God sent a plague among them. But the wind that God sent pushed the quail down low enough to the ground. It doesn't say that God killed the quail or anything. Pushed them down low enough to the ground, and they just knocked them out of the air with clubs. And that's what the 2 cubits, or 3 or so feet off the ground, means. Let's see, I have another scripture jotted down, Numbers 21. Oh, we don't need that one. That has to do with something else. And the final thing that God supplied is what we mentioned already, and that's the manna. First of all, the water, then quails. Then he's given them manna, Exodus 16:35. Which tells us how they were able to be sustained according to food in the wilderness. And we know from other places in Scripture that they walked through the whole wilderness and their clothes didn't wear out on them. But To find out how they were able to live, that is, eat and drink, is another matter. And the Scriptures tell us how they did. By the water, by the quail, and by the manna that God provided for them supernaturally. Okay, another reason the critics tell us that the number is too high is that it would have been impossible for one man, Moses, to successfully guide that many people through such terrible circumstances. If you ever have been a housewife and you get 3 of them yelling at the same time, it's enough to just get 3 of them calmed down and controlled. How about 3 million of them that you are personally responsible for? Again, that's pretty much an impossibility for one man to be able to successfully lead 3 million people through what he himself called in Deuteronomy 8, that great and terrible wilderness, and through the many and manifold and trying temptations and circumstances through which the people went. Well, does the Bible say that Moses did this by himself? No, the Bible does not say that Moses had to do all this by himself. First of all, in Exodus 17, verses 8 to 13, we see Joshua and Hur helping Moses. So there we've got 3 men, not counting Aaron. Aaron would give us 4 men. Then in Exodus 18, this is the second group of people, verses 13 to 24. Remember, at the advice of Jethro, he appointed captains over thousands, captains over hundreds, captains over 50s, captains over 10s. So here we don't know how many people are chosen here, but many more men chosen in Exodus 18, according to the advice of Jethro, Moses' father-in-law. So Moses, remember, was put over all of the people, but there were men over a certain 1,000 and men over a certain 100, and they would deal with the problems until they got to the point where they were beyond their control. Then they would take them to Moses. Because we know that the critics have a good excuse here, because the Scripture tells us, according to what Jethro said in Exodus 18, Moses, if you don't change this, you'll wear both yourself out and all the people. He's right, and the critics are right. Moses couldn't have done this by himself. Then finally, in Numbers 11, 16 to 30, we have the 70 elders chosen. Now, these 70 elders are over and above however many men were chosen back in Exodus 18. This is a different group of men. 70 elders chosen, where, remember, God said that I'll take of the spirit of you and I'll put them upon the 70 elders, and they'll bear the load with you. Because in Numbers 11, Moses comes before God and said, Lord, I can't handle this many people. And we know that he couldn't. The Scriptures doesn't say that he did. We've got 3 examples here of people added to him to help him. So first of all, we could say about that, Moses didn't lead the people by himself. He had helpers. Secondly, he had miracles to keep him in charge. This is one thing that helped him keep in charge of all the affairs throughout all the host of Israel by working miracles in their sight. Exodus 14:31, Numbers 12:10 to 15, Numbers chapter 16, Deuteronomy 34, verses 10 to 12. Whenever he had problems that he couldn't handle, then sometimes he just would work a miracle, and that would get everyone's attention, or it would get rid of some of the people, like it did in Numbers chapter 16. So he had helpers to help him, and he had miracles also to aid him, keeping in charge of the people. Then a fourth and a final problem the critics bring to us. They tell us that the marching orders and the organization of chapters 2 and 10 are impossible. Contradictory and confusing. The marching and organization orders of chapters 2 and 10 of Numbers are impossible. We'll say more about that in another message when we get to those chapters. But they bring up just the common excuse that, like I just said, let's say you want to get your family ready just to come to the meeting here tonight. How long does it take you, if you've got a half a dozen or a dozen children, to get all of them ready to come to the meeting? Takes you time. Again, what would you do if you had 3 million people? And some of them are asleep. I mean, you've got to get all of them out of bed in the morning. They've got to all get up, get their goods packed. Before they can ever start marching, you've got to organize them first. And how in the world are you going to organize? You've got no, radio contact. You'll call this group and that group. How in the world are you going to organize someone that's spread over the area of Minneapolis to get all of them doing everything at the same time with one another? It's a lot larger than you probably ever thought before. To get all those people ready at the same time with no communication available. So we'll say more about that in another message. That finishes up the name of Numbers. Any questions on that? Okay, we come to the purpose of Numbers. What is the purpose of this great book of Numbers? It's a great book. It, like the book Exodus, is a book with a lot of action taking place in it. Leviticus and Deuteronomy are just the opposite. Little or no action taking place in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Some, but very little. Whereas Numbers and Exodus are the two books, now we're excluding Genesis, we're talking about the Mosaic period. Exodus and Numbers are the books that have a lot of action in them. Leviticus and Deuteronomy are basically a lot of talking and speaking, not a lot of action there. The purpose of the book of Numbers is to show why Israel did not enter the promised land and to warn readers of unbelief. That's the number one primary purpose for the book. And we'll see that in chapters 13 and 14, two of the most dismal chapters in all the history of Israel. The whole book is geared to show us why they did not enter the promised land. And of course we know why, because of unbelief. And then on the basis of that, to warn readers of the great sin of unbelief. Now in conclusion, if you'll quickly turn over to the book of Hebrews, I want to show you how Hebrews parallels the Pentateuch in a way that's very unique, in a way in which the book of Psalms also does, that we'll mention when we get to the book of Psalms. You can jot this down. This is interesting, the way Hebrews, the 13 chapters in Hebrews, parallels the 5 books of Moses. Chapter 1 of Hebrews reminds us of the book of Genesis, because we see creation in Hebrews 1. Chapter 2 of Hebrews parallels the book of Exodus. Chapter 2 talks about the word spoken by angels. That's Exodus 19, the book of Exodus. As I've already told you, chapters 5 to 10 speak of what book, or parallel what book? Leviticus. Chapters 5 to 10 parallel Leviticus exactly. Chapters 11 to 13, what's that all about? Faith and possessing your possessions. That parallels the book of Deuteronomy. That's the characteristic theme of Deuteronomy, is to possess the land. Which leaves us with chapters 3 and 4 of Hebrews to parallel the book of Numbers. Now let's just turn over to chapter 3 and I'll give you an example here. These two chapters, it's interesting the way this whole book just parallels the whole Pentateuch. Hebrews 3:7. This is speaking of the book of Numbers here. Wherefore, as the Holy Ghost saith, he's quoting, I believe, from Psalm 95, but that refers back to Numbers. Today, if ye will hear his voice, harden not your hearts, as in the provocation, in the day of temptation in Bamidbar, the wilderness, when your fathers tempted me and proved me and saw my works 40 years. Wherefore I was grieved with that generation and said, they do always err in their heart, they have not known my ways. So I swear in my wrath, they shall not enter into my rest. Take heed, brethren. Now he's admonishing us on the basis of their failure in Numbers. Take heed, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily, while it is called today, lest any of you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. Verse 16, for some, when they heard, did provoke, howbeit not all that came out of Egypt by Moses. But with whom was he grieved 40 years? Was it not with them that had sinned, whose carcasses fell in the wilderness? And to whom sware he that they should not enter into his rest? But to them that believe not. So we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief. Chapter 4, let us therefore fear, lest the promise, that great promise given to Abraham, the patriarchal trinity of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, being left us of entering into his rest, any of you should seem to come short of it. For unto us was the gospel preached as well as unto them, but the word preached did not profit them, not being mixed with faith in them that heard it. And he's warning us on that basis of that whole book of Numbers, don't sin the same sin that the Israelites sinned. That's the damning sin of unbelief. And you'll never enter into God's rest with that sin. And your memory scripture, Numbers 23, 19, and 20. Some of you will probably already know it, but you can brush up on it. Numbers 23, 19, and 20. So we'll start with, let's start with chapter 1 next time then.